Coach
Sorry
Walters,
about that.
back? You back?
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
I told the end of the Briar Rabbit story.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and you know, at one point Kennedy calls Eisenhower for advice. Says, "What would you do with Vietnam?" And Eisenhower lets loose on him. Starts yelling at him, saying, "You know what I'd have done with Vietnam? I would have never sent troops to Vietnam. I never would have gotten involved there. Why did you do that?" And it shows you kind of the frustration with how quickly Vietnam begins this downward spiral of once we get involved, it's very hard for us to back away from it. So, are there any kind of questions over? I know sorry if I ramble a little bit there about the impetus there of Vietnam and why we got in there. Is there any questions, or would anybody like to make a further comment as to why all of a sudden Vietnam begins to be America's battleground here for the next, honestly, almost 15 years?
What's ironic about Eisenhower and his little rant to Kennedy about not getting involved in Vietnam is it's actually Eisenhower that first sends advisors to Vietnam once the French pull out. We still want to support the democratic South, and we think we can do a better job than the French by not using the military, but using political influence. So in reality, it's Eisenhower that gets us involved. Kennedy is the first one to actually send in forces to control different areas.
Yep, that's a good point. You know, and Eisenhower, you know, it's tough because Eisenhower is such a military, you know, strategist, and you know, he said he drew a fine line between an advisor and boots on the ground. And Kennedy said, well, you're sending in the military. I mean, I don't know why you're acting like what I did was so different. You sent in the military. They knew the military was involved. So I think that's a great point as well. Eisenhower absolutely was sending military advisors there already. That's a good point. I'll make another point about just Vietnam in general. Vietnam begins to be an incredibly nasty war for many reasons, but again, as the Americans try different strategies through the 60s and 70s, you have Kennedy who leaves office, and you have next you're going to have Lyndon Johnson, who really begins to be more and more involved, because once we get started, here's the reality. Does America lose wars? No, like
never.
This is America post-World War II. Like, we just beat the Nazis, we beat the Japanese, we don't lose, right? So once we get involved, none of our presidents felt like they could back away. Like, you got to win it, right? I mean, as sticky as it's getting, as difficult as it is to define winning, like, what does it mean to win? I know that sounds weird. You're probably looking at me going, what do you mean win? Like, you beat the other team. Okay, well, what about when the other team just runs and hides from you the whole time? Okay.
Well, and the other thing that needs to be discussed is Johnson's attitude towards everything. Lyndon Johnson loomed large over politics, not just in the Senate, but even when he became vice president, he controlled a lot of what Kennedy was doing. And then when he ascends to the presidency upon Kennedy's death, Vietnam becomes his political legacy, if you want to call it that, because he stakes so much in terms of what he was doing globally in Vietnam. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Coach Walters, but he even had maps of Vietnam in his office, and he was picking bombing targets for that afternoon's bombing raids.
Right.
Like, he was uber involved in Vietnam.
Definitely.
Wait, are presidents allowed to do that? Like, choose the target?
Yes, but normally they give that over to a military commander, a general.
So Olivia hit on a really good question that I'd kind of like to examine for a second, because this is, again, one of the things we're going to emphasize here is we've got kind of shortened amounts of time with you guys. You know, we'll do kind of an hour on Tuesday and Thursdays. And by the way, if anybody, feel free to reach out if you guys want, ever need a morning session or something else. Just holler at me again. I mean, we can make it work. But I really want to look at it thematically. You know, like, I wanted to talk a lot of just foreign policy today, and we'll talk next time. We'll talk about some elections. on Thursday. We're going to talk about kind of, I've kind of just glossed over, Kennedy becoming president, Nixon, but, we'll talk about that more on Thursday. But today I'm really wanting to focus on foreign policy. And Olivia brings up a great point, which is how specific are the president's wartime powers? And as Coach Hampton pointed out, presidents do that from time to time. I mean, Lincoln got very involved in the Civil War, if you'll remember. I mean, he's firing generals like crazy. And a lot of generals at the time criticized Lincoln for that. A lot of political people did. They said, "Why? You're not the general. Why are you telling the generals to charge, to be aggressive, to take this battleground, blah, blah, blah?" And Lincoln said, "Look, I'm tired of losing. Like, this is taking forever. Like, what are they doing?" And then you see some other military commanders in office. I mean, again, Eisenhower led the D-Day invasion. So for him, that was absolutely, he thought he was well within his rights to do that. If you guys remember, as recently as President Obama, do you remember what he was criticized for when it came to this topic?
He fired the general in charge of the war in Afghanistan. We talked about that when we talked about Truman firing MacArthur.
Yep, General McChrystal. He fires McChrystal. And the other thing that he did that's interesting with technology today is President Obama literally picked who we should drone overseas. And people thought that was incredible because, I mean, think about it. It's one thing for a president to say, "Hey, you should fight this battle or this battle." President Obama was able to say, "Hey, see this picture of this guy? You go shoot him here. Here's the satellite imagery. Shoot him now. Go shoot him right now." I mean, it's incredible that technology enabled him to do that. But a lot of people thought, I say a lot of people, I mean, it was kind of a political issue, right? But, people were questioning whether that was right or not. But now we have that kind of power. I mean, you could have President Trump that can literally look through a satellite imagery and say, "Yep, that dude, we're right there. Pick him off." It's fascinating. It's something that we fought over time, as Olivia pointed out, that we've had presidents that go, "Listen, you read the Constitution, it says I'm commander-in-chief. Okay, that means I call the shots. You don't have to like it, but if I want to come down and tell you to go right there to that battlefield, I'll tell you to go right down to that battlefield." But again, there's a political price to pay for that, right? If people don't like your decision, they're going to say, "Well, why don't you just listen to the generals?" But most of the time we've given the presidents pretty broad authority when it comes to wartime power like that. It's great. It's a great point. In all of this discussion was really my next discussion question I had on here, which you're going to hear the United States get accused of a lot. As Vietnam goes on, and guys, it gets really difficult to win. Because here's the other problem. Again, I highly recommend, I'm kind of throwing some movies out for you today. And since you guys got a lot of free time at home, maybe you'll take me up on some of these movie recommendations, since y'all never listen to any of the movies I tell y'all to watch. But We Were Soldiers. We Were Soldiers is an excellent movie. It's a good read, too. It's a really quick read. But they talk about how different the war was. I think they do a great job in that film of showing you that they'll go win a battle. I mean, think about how depressing this would be as a soldier. You go and win a battle on this field. Let's do Ia Drang Valley, because they fought there multiple times. They win a battle there. 2 weeks later, they go, "You need to go back to Ia Drang Valley." And you go, "What? We just won a battle there 3 weeks ago." "Yeah, well, they retreated and they hid, and then now they're back." You got to go win a battle on the same place like 3 different times. It got incredibly depressing for our soldiers as the enemy would retreat into other countries like Cambodia and Laos, and we couldn't follow them because we didn't declare war on those countries. And so the war just seemed like this continuous, thing that would never die, that you could never really win because there were so many of them, and they would just hide. They would retreat if they were losing, which is a brilliant strategy on their part. This really is the modernization of guerrilla warfare. Okay, they really take that to a whole new level of, all right, well, if we're losing, we're just going to leave. Like, we're not going to sit here and get beat. Like, we're going to leave. We'll live to fight another day. The North Vietnamese do an outstanding job of evading our troops and also making themselves very indistinguishable between them and civilians. So you're going to hear a lot of stories of our troops killing civilians in Vietnam, and some of that is absolutely terrible, that our troops sometimes made decisions that they shouldn't have made. But there are times where you're going to see scenarios where it was incredibly difficult, where civilians are pulling these plastic bombs they would hide under their shirts, and all of a sudden you got a woman that's about to blow you up. What do you do? And it's just these terrible scenarios like that You hear a
Well,
lot.
Ryan, you might want to mention that, Vietnam is not flat, and America loves a good flat war. Think about Desert Storm, think about World War
Yep.
I and World War II, all sorts of flat surfaces where you can drive tanks in, you can bomb a whole bunch of stuff. Vietnam is very mountainous. It's a lot of jungle. It's really, really easy to hide in there.
Outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Mack, for that. Pointing out, yeah, I mean, and you, again, I'm going to go back to my movie there. We Were Soldiers talks about we have to use these helicopters to get in. You can't march through the terrain. You can't find individuals. The geographic aspect of the war is also a whole other topic that, again, is fascinating from the perspective of how do we win and how many people they have. You see this all the time where we underestimate how many people are here or there or where did they go. That's a great point. And it also, by the way, puts our troops in a terrible situation where you got to fly these helicopters in to these very small landing zones. So just think about this, guys. As you're landing helicopters in, you can only land 1 or 2 at a time. So for a little bit, there's like 10 or 20 of you, and you might have thousands of enemy troops surrounding you if you're not careful. If we don't know where they are, I mean, it's going to take us hours to move hundreds of troops into some of these areas. And so you hear a lot of stories too. I mentioned Ia Drang Valley earlier. Our troops nearly it's a miracle that they were able to get out of there alive. Many of them did, but they got completely overrun because, again, as Mr. Mack pointed out, the geographic challenges that they couldn't march through, they couldn't use tanks through there. It was very, very difficult terrain to mobilize troops. That's a really good.
Ryan, there's a statistic out there that the average lifespan of a lieutenant in Vietnam War was 11 seconds. So like a lieutenant is just one step above a private, you know what I'm saying? And so it's ridiculous how fast all these people were killed. But just to that point that you were saying, like they'd have to get dropped into the jungle and then, just wish luck. There are no supply trains that can kind of reinforce them. I mean, it's super slow moving. And like you said, that they would have to just give up the territory as soon as they won it, was just super frustrating, and it just drug on, and it turned into a terrible political thing for LBJ as well.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk kind of, guys, the political side of this on Thursday. But as Mr. Mack pointed out in Lyndon Johnson's presidency, he's haunted with this. How do I A, win this war, or B, can I get out, with some sense of, I see Emma Judkins messaged on here about, isn't it also, let me see what she wrote, something about, would this make America look less powerful if we lost this war? Absolutely. If we lose this, there's a sense of, we're kind of doing this whole view where us and the Russians are the two most powerful nations in the world. If we lose a war, guys, think about it. In Vietnam, we're the United States of America, and they're a populous country considering how small they are, but nothing compared to the United States of America. They have nowhere near the firepower we do, nowhere near the military assets as we do. I mean, if we don't win this war, we have really damaged our military reputation worldwide. That is absolutely playing in the minds of our presidents during this time as well.
Not to mention, he's got, back then, the White House, the Pennsylvania Avenue ran pretty close in front of the White House, and you could hear Lyndon Johnson tells the story that he could hear the people on the streets outside the White House chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And hearing that over and over wore on him. I mean, literally sitting in the White House in the Oval Office, he's hearing people chant this, his own people, and it broke him down mentally.
Yep. Yeah, and I would just to harp on that once again, think about the whole picture. This is the flower power movement. This is the 60s. Like, we had just gotten segregation going on. And so there's a war in Vietnam that is super unpopular, but there was also a war at home with, getting the segregation thing going, Jim Crow out of the way, and all these sort of things. Lyndon Johnson did a war on poverty at this point in time. Lyndon Johnson had a rough go of it. On all fronts.
Absolutely. And I think I appreciate that point there by Mr. Mack also about we want to make sure we also understand while we're talking about things thematically, you know, while we're really focusing on foreign policy right now, you got to remember that's, you know, there's other things going on. Again, you're in the middle of the civil rights movement. You're in the middle of the countercultural movement that's really pushing back on a lot of the establishment forces here. I mean, so Lyndon Johnson has got quite the task in front of him, and it's amazing because I'm going to give you more of his political background on Thursday, but as a guy that was so incredibly well versed in politics and how to get legislation through, I mean, he is just really overburdened with Vietnam and all of these other things going on at once. The 60s are this tremendous time where there's just so many things going on at that moment that makes it really difficult to navigate politically. I want to address the next discussion question I have on there, which is really kind of this broad question that you're going to hear a lot now, but you even hear it back then, is this description of the United States as the world police. Is that a term that you think applies to the United States at this point in time? By the way, I've got a great comment here from one of Holden Caldwell that talks about, could we have won Vietnam relatively easily by sending troops that were needed, that were requested? There is absolutely, in the 1970s, we have this moment where Congress decides to not continue appropriating funds and military supplies. We actually leave with the communists pretty well defeated militarily, okay? I always kind of with students, and again, guys, if you want to get into Vietnam, I'm telling you, it's a fascinating one just because of all the complexity of it. But militarily, by the end of this war, we have completely debilitated their ability to fight a war, okay? So to your point there, Holden, absolutely. By the end of this war, by 1975, we have completely debilitated. We have letters from their general, Ho Chi Minh, who says, we really can't functionally fight as a military anymore. That's how well our troops by the end of this had done. But as we begin to peel back rapidly in 1975, we begin to see, we see a rush and an overthrow of our South Vietnamese capital there, of Saigon. So you're going to see those images in the 70s. And so that's a question, guys. Usually I do a debate, did we lose Vietnam War? Okay. And I always leave that up to students. And usually kind of the nuanced answer is militarily, no. You can't point to a battle we lost at the end, but politically, did we achieve our objective? No. Like, I mean, if I make you pick, did we win or lose? We lost South Vietnam to a Vietnamese force. So in the end, yeah, we did not achieve our objectives, but I think he makes a great point there that militarily, when we talk about the back half of that war, we did an incredibly efficient job at controlling a very difficult force to defeat there. But that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk about America as a world police. So tell me, is that an accurate description of what we kind of morph into during the 60s and beyond?
Yes.
Why, Olivia?
Because in the 60s, we're in this fight with Cuba, and we even send covert operations into Cuba to assassinate Fidel Castro because we don't like him and we don't like what he's doing. We do the same thing in Vietnam. We don't like what they're doing. So yeah, we are policing them. We're telling them what they can and can't do, especially in the 90s after 9/11, early 2000s.
And I think that Vietnam was morally the right thing to do, but in the people's eyes, we're just viewed as the aggressor and taking actions that aren't necessary in order to maintain this global dominance and peace throughout the world.
I also think it should be said that the United States was kind of in a position where they were kind of being forced to protect the established order of peace that was brought about by the First and Second World War, and they didn't want to have to lose that or lose their sphere of influence from the democratic world. So,
great stuff. Anybody else? I don't think there's a wrong answer, by the way. I mean, I think you could. This is one of those, I like this because I see a lot of essay prompts that are similar to this, that are basically asking you. You see us, obviously, post-World War II. We take a much more hands-on approach, right? So does that make us, is world police, is that appropriate? Is that terminology? You can pick at that, right? You can say, no, we weren't, because we're looking out for our own best interest, right? We're not trying to fix everything, right? We're trying to fix things that help us. Or you might say, well, but a lot of those things don't help us directly, so we are kind of getting involved in those scenarios that maybe are not what a typical international relations would look like. So you can explore that either way. As I kind of put that out there as for you to do that. I do want to kind of jump on what Daniel said there as
Daniel had a great point.
Yeah, I think Daniel, I think it's important to point out that from the United States perspective, and you're going to hear this, and this might be trying to think, what's it called when they give you two scenarios and there's actually a third one, but they paint it like there's only two choices? Oh my gosh, just escaped me. But anyway, a lot of our government officials say, you do realize if we don't get engaged, the Russians are going to get engaged. I mean, if we don't help here, the Russians are going to. So we wish there was this third option of, yeah, that's not really our fight, or we don't really want to engage there, or what. But, you hear a lot of American officials that say there's really not that option. If we don't, the Russians take over, and we are going to deal with a much bigger problem down the road. That's at least a thought process there, and I think that's important to remember. Now, you can challenge that, right? You can say, well, maybe the Russians weren't going to take everything. Maybe they were. I will say, there's a lot of people that point out in the Keenan telegram that he says that they're irrational actors, that the Russians are just going to blindly go after, they're going to just grow. I would kind of argue with that, because I think they're very rational if you understand what they're after, right? I mean, we might say they're like so aggressive, it's borderline irrational. From their perspective, they're going, no, actually, we're just really aggressive in achieving what our foreign policy aims are. Like America, we don't have the need for these geographic resources. They do. And so they're kind of unflinching in that. I mean, they're again, if you remember from world history, I mean, they're a very, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but they're a group of people that live in very harsh conditions, a lot of their population for a large part of the year. And when it comes to situations where they can gain resources and help their lifestyle, and I mean like as a country, by gaining these resources where they're not dependent on their neighbors, historically they have been, guys, even remember back in world history, I mean, Ivan the Great, Catherine the Great, do you remember why they were defined as the Great? It was how much territory they captured. And I remember talking to you guys about the difference between Ivan the Terrible and Ivan the Great. And the reality is, it wasn't necessarily in how harsh they were sometimes. It was, did they actually get something done? Like, they could tolerate you being harsh if you got something done. But it was when you didn't get things done that they, I digress there a little bit into Russian history, but I do think it's one of those things that's important to see America's world police in the 60s and 70s being in the backdrop of dealing with a very aggressive Russian force. But fast forward that to the 80s, 90s, and today. Is describing America as a world police today appropriate?
I say yes still, but
Tell me
not
why.
as much because of what happened after 9/11, how we went and took over terrorism. We put a war on it, and we just started invading Middle Eastern countries because we didn't like what they were doing, and we didn't like what they were doing to us.
I mean, the war on terror absolutely extended kind of our foreign policy reach, right? Because, I mean, that really, you saw terrorist activity in so many Middle Eastern countries that all of a sudden, you guys, your whole life, we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, these are wars you guys have grown up with your whole life and heard about our troops dealing with different situations in some of these countries. That's been a charge against us since 9/11. You also see why we would be more aggressive after 9/11. So I want to take time here. We got about 9 minutes left here. I think this was a really good discussion. I hope this was helpful just to kind of I wanted to wrap up World War II and kind of give you at least a high level view of what happens post World War II. Okay, just generally speaking, you have two world powers that compete in this Cold War, where they do proxy wars, Korea, Vietnam proxy wars. And then you see up into the 80s and 90s, really what ends up happening is when the Soviet Union economically crashes, we're all that's left. I mean, I don't mean we're all that's left in the sense of obviously there's other powerful countries, but do you guys think anybody can argue in the 1990s that America is the most powerful military in the world? I mean, where you go into Iraq and defeat an entire army in a few weeks in the first Iraq war, right? I mean, you know, by that point in the early 90s, the first Persian Gulf War, people cannot believe that we're going into another country, we're throwing out an entire military, and we're barely losing any lives. It was absolutely this moment in history where people, guys, this is weird. In the 1990s, there's a famous, one of the most famous articles written by a political scientist was called The End of History. I got to be careful saying his name, but his name is Francis Fukuyama. Okay. But he writes this article, and what he says is, this is it. Like, technology is so advanced because America is so powerful, things are never going to be the same. Like, they are going to be so much more powerful. I mean, even think about Alexander the Great, Napoleon. You couldn't go win a war like that. I mean, it took this just incredible mobilization of people, of resources, but now with technology, boom, America could go in and win a war so relatively quickly. So I wanted to bring you up to that speed, but now I want to back up and let's just do a general overview and let's talk really thematically here, really high level. When we start in American history, when we talk about that first government, do you remember what Washington said in his farewell address about foreign policy?
He said we should not intervene and stay out and keep it to our own affairs.
Yep, said don't get bogged down overseas, okay? England and France are going to continue to fight. Let's not get involved. We go from that. You have an issue with the Tripolian pirates, okay? So Jefferson sends troops to Tripoli to defeat pirates that keep attacking our ships. We then have what? War of 1812, where we have kind of, you know, it's American Revolution 2.0, right? But throughout that period, we're pretty isolationist, right? We're kind of keeping to ourselves. You have little kind of changes in our foreign policy, but we don't see troops being sent different places for the most part. Then what do we have that happens in the 1840s?
Start of the Civil War.
No, before that. Mexican-American War, right? Yeah, that one's easy to skip over. Mexican-American War. Do not forget that we expand our territory into Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona by fighting an aggressive war for territory. Okay, so that's James K. Polk as president. So we start this, okay, we're going to be aggressive here because we believe in manifest destiny and we should control our continent, right? That's a little change, right? Civil War, Civil War is obviously going to be unique. We can talk about that, but we have this war between the states. Then we have the Spanish-American War. And remember, I went through the political cartoons with you guys, and we really pointed out that remember, there was a strong anti-imperialist sentiment in the country that said, whoa, 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 whoa. Wait, what are we doing? We're fighting Cuba, why? We want to fight in Puerto Rico, why? What are we doing here? Why are we fighting in the Philippines? What are we doing? And remember that a lot of Americans thought this is a shift. Okay, we're being much more aggressive. We're looking to expand our power. Okay, this isn't the Monroe Doctrine that says leave us alone over here. This is much more aggressive. If you guys remember the political cartoon of the guy that, like, on the menu, he has all those different countries and he says, what am I going to eat next? And it's like America saying we're going to eat all the countries around us. So that's 1890s. When you go into World War I, before World War I, we're still pretty neutral, right? If you remember, I mean, Woodrow Wilson really has to convince America to go to World War I. We get involved in World War I. Are we quick to jump into World War II? No. Remember, people are really, until the attack on Pearl Harbor, I mean, America's sentiment is very much, we do not need to go get involved in World War II. So we win that, and now notice the change post-World War II. Isn't that fascinating that after the First World War, we say, look, hey, no, we don't want to be dragged in this again. Post-World War II, though, we have this very aggressive stance. It really has, for the most part, okay, we could talk about kind of the ebbs and flows of it, but generally speaking, we're much more likely to be engaged overseas. Why do you think that changed post-World War II?
I think post-World War II, we kind of found our success, and we knew that we could kind of expand our sphere of influence, just like Soviet Russia knew that they could try and expand their sphere of influence. So that eventually ended up in a collision course, and that's what set off the Cold War.
That's a great point. Anybody else want to add to? I think Daniel makes a great point here. I'm just trying to make sure that I read the comments here before we get off. I think that Daniel makes a great point. I think it's important to realize we are very successful, number one. Number two, there is also this realization that it's hard to avoid things now, right? I mean, like, you know, World War I, we thought, look, we can stay out of this. But with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans thought, if we're really one of the world superpowers, if we're really one of the top 2 superpowers in the world, can we simply ignore when Russia is on the aggression? Can we simply ignore some of these broader global confrontations? And a lot of Americans start saying, listen, we're going to have to be more engaged. We're going to have to be more aggressive. Now, not all Americans. By the way, every war we've ever fought, there's always an opposition. I mean, they're really, you can look back, I mean, even World War II, there's still a group of people going, do we really need to fight Germany? Like, can't we just hit Japan and be done with this? There's always, I mean, Americans have relatively, you know, there's always been a group of Americans that are reluctant to jump into wars. But post-World War II, we really see an embrace of, we are a global power. We're one of the 2 global powers in really this bipolar world. And we can't hardly avoid it. And really, some of that is technological. I mean, if you can shoot us with a missile, and World War II, if you have the ability to get warships over here and destroy our battleships, and then post-World War II, if you have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, even in the 50s and 60s from Cuba that could reach New York City, Boston, but then post-1950s, we're talking about ICBMs that, again, could be launched from submarines. You see a sense that really since then, America has been much more engaged with foreign powers ever since. Again, I just want to make sure I address these questions before we get off here. I'm trying to read yours. Olivia said, yes.
It's just.
Yeah, go ahead, Olivia.
Oh, it was just little stuff that I was wondering about.
Okay. I'm trying to say, why does he start backing down? Okay, so one of the things, I do want to address this. This is a really specific question she had. I know I told you guys till 3 o'clock. If you need to get off, you can get off the call. And we're going to do this again on Thursday, okay? So if you have time, 2 o'clock Thursday, we're going to set that up. Again, if there's a time issue for any of you, please shoot me an email, send me a message if you want to set this up. Again, I can squeeze this in some other times if necessary, if you need me to. And again, I'm going to post this video later on YouTube, but I'll put it on my Twitter account and I'll put it up on the website as well. But Olivia's question here, why does the Soviet Union back down? So let's talk about Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'll try to do this briefly. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are missiles in Cuba. We know that. We have satellite images of it. We surround Cuba, and we tell the Soviets, if you send any more ships, we're going to stop them. Soviets send the ships. Ships are on their way. They stop. Here's our blockade. Here's their ships. They're literally right there, okay? And we start negotiating with them. And we make an agreement, this is important, that we will move our nuclear weapons out of Turkey. They viewed that as a threat. They said, look, if you're going to put missiles in Turkey, why can't we put them in Cuba? So we said, if we move our missiles out of Turkey, will you move your missiles out of Cuba? The first time, Khrushchev agrees. He sends us a message agreeing to do that. He then sends a second message saying, nope, no deal. Why did he send 2 messages? Anybody know why? If you knew this, I'd be really impressed. He sent the first one. He then went to get approval from the Politburo. They're like the governing body, right? It's kind of, they're kind of have a different setup than we do. But he's the head of the government, but there's kind of this political group that he answers to. And they said, absolutely not. That would be backing down. So he sends a second telegram. Kennedy wisely just replies to the first one. He acts like he never got the second one. He just sends a reply. Deal. Got it. We'll move the missiles out of Turkey. You move the missiles out of Cuba. So anyway, it's fascinating. So Khrushchev's like, this could be like, World War III, so I'm going to take the deal. And by the way, they remove him out of power shortly after. But we secretly move our missiles out of Turkey. That's part of the agreement. We're not going to make a big deal of it. We're going to do it secretly. But the world knows the Russians moved the missiles out of Cuba. So it looks like they back down, doesn't it? But in reality, it's kind of a mutual de-escalation. But the Russians, this really does not set well with them post-Cuban Missile Crisis, that we have embarrassed them on a global stage. So that's something to keep in mind, too, as you see them kind of refusing to de-escalate in the 70s. And then when you go up to so anyway, that addresses your question about why they looked like they backed down. They really thought it was a mutual thing. And then in the 90s, they ran out of money. Like they have an economic depression that hits in the 80s. And it's very fascinating because Ronald Reagan says, we're going to grow our military budget. And a lot of people said, well, you said you wanted to like shrink government budgets. But his goal was he heard that the Russians were running out of money. And he thought, if I start making all of these weapons and start using all this money, the Russians will try to keep up. And what will happen?
They'll go.
They run out of money.
Yeah. And so it works. I mean, for a while, people are going, oh, this is dangerous. We're building all these weapons and they're building all these weapons. But then what ends up happening is the Russians run out of money and they're spending it all on their military and their people start rioting on them because their economy's crashing. So in the end, they simply can't. Like they can't keep up. And so they just fall apart and here we are today. Great question. Again, I don't want you to think that you can't ask any more questions. Please feel free off the call. Send any messages that you have. Great comment by Holden Caldwell there too about it is very important to also see in American foreign policy that there's absolutely a view, and you see this sometimes, right? It's unavoidable that America gets involved in global affairs sometimes to try to keep bad things from happening. Now, sometimes people are critical of that, right? But you see the Americans that get involved in certain situations, and sometimes it's backfired on us. If you've ever seen Black Hawk Down, it's a great movie. Again, feel like I'm like the movie review guy right now, but it's a great movie where the Americans, we try to stop an ethnic cleansing in Somalia. We're trying to stop these tribes from killing each other. One of our helicopters goes down. Listen to this. One of our helicopters goes down, and the people we're keeping from getting slaughtered kill our troops and surround the helicopters. It's a great movie, but this happened to Bill Clinton. And it was one of these things where Americans, we were just going, what is going on? We just put our troops in danger to save you. And these people had kind of bought propaganda that we were against them, even though we were there to help them, and kill a couple of our soldiers, shoot down our helicopter, and actually drag some of our troops to the streets. So great point. I wanted to address that. Again, guys, if you have any further comments, questions, please feel free to text them to me, tweet them to me, email them to me. And at the beginning of the next call, I'll address questions first. But I'm going to do a similar format unless I hear back from you guys that there was something that you didn't like or I could do better for the next one. But I'll put a document on there with some questions for you to think about beforehand. And I'd like for you to give it some thought just so we can jump right into it, right? So thank you guys again for your participation. I thought that was a great discussion. I appreciated all the feedback. I thought that was great. I'll post the video later if you want to review or if anybody else does. And again, I'm going to continue on the next Zoom invite. I'll also share some other resources with you as well so that way when you guys log on there before the call, you can kind of see what all I've posted. So again, feel free to check the website because I create a whole new page on my website that's just really to give you guys quick, easy access to this material and the videos and things like that. So I hope that's helpful. Anybody want to say anything else here before we get off the call? All right. Well, I hope you guys have a good rest of the day. I'll plan on seeing you guys on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Thank you guys again for your feedback and for being here. I hope you guys stay safe, and hope everything's going all right for you.
You as well, Coach.